No.
Good, thank you. I'll open my presentation, and what I'll do is I'll actually, as an introduction, as Estonia and Latvia have shared a history for certainly the last 800 years. We don't know much about the time before that. I'll present some details of this sort of history and also the situation now from the Soviet Union period and afterwards, comparing the two, well, sort of taking the two countries together. I'll then give some specifics on Latvia and then hand over to Delaney, who'll talk us about some specifics on Estonia. Just the bare facts. Estonian is a language that's spoken as a first language by around 1 million speakers. Another couple of 100,000, around 200,000, are speakers of Estonian as a second language. So that's the size of the languages in relation to Estonia. Latvia is slightly larger, about 1.5 million first language speakers of Latvian, and about 500,000 speakers of Latvian as a second language. And I mention this because this feature of small languages having second language speakers is often fairly uncommon. We tend to think of big languages, English, French, Russian, as having lots of second language speakers. But here in the Baltic states, it's very significant and a very significant part of language policy, as we'll explain, why we have these second language speakers. It's also, I think, very instructive for other places, including Catalonia, but Wales, Quebec, of course, that have also tried to encourage speakers of other languages, often other dominant languages, to also learn those languages as a second language. And certainly for the Baltic states, the status of the languages themselves are very dependent upon getting a lot of other speakers of other languages to learn those languages as a second language. So we have a particular slant on language policy, I think, from the Baltic states, which is very important. I'm going to go through 800 years of history very quickly because we don't have a lot of time. And in Greek and Roman times, the Baltic states were known for one thing, apart from being very cold and a long way away, and that was amber. And the amber coast of the Baltic, the semi-precious amber, was what drew the interest of many from the south of Europe and elsewhere. The short history, the pre-Christian period, pre the 13th century, amber, of course, seafaring. The Estonia and Latvia were the road to Novgorod, the great trading city, now a small city in Russia, but the city of Alexander Nevsky. The societies were rural. They were seafaring, some engaged in Viking-like activities. But very importantly, by the 13th century, they were the last parts of Europe not to be Christian. The three Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, that area. And when the Crusades failed in the Middle East, then the Crusaders turned their attention to what was in the north. And starting in the 12th century and very seriously in the 13th century, they then invaded. The Danes took Tallinn, and then, as one did in those days, they sold it to the Germans, to the German Crusaders. You could sell and buy and sell anything then, and why not sell this lovely city of Tallinn? And that's what they did. The Germans, and by Germans I mean religious orders that were essentially German-speaking. There was, of course, no Germany there, but from the German lands, these settlers came, and they came, as we tend to say in the Baltics, with sword and cross. But the religious side of it really fell away very quickly because the Crusaders became the city merchants, and Riga, Tallinn, other Baltic cities became part of the Hansa League. The first I think it's the first globalised non-state institution that we have, the Hanse League. And in the country, the German knights called themselves barons and formed the German-speaking Livonian order that ruled this area of Estonia and Latvia. They very quickly became Protestants. They thought that Protestantism was a very good thing. They would have to give far less money to the church, and basically the church would do what they said rather than needing to obey the Pope in Rome. So Protestantism spread very quickly, and one should say that while Protestantism is nominally the religion of Latvia and Estonia, it was always a veneer because it was very much a German religion, and paganism is still very strong there. As somebody remarked before, they were good pagans. The church was German, but if you like, the Protestant spirit, which the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, as Weber said, this Protestant spirit has been very marked in the Baltic states. We'll see some evidence for that. Now, the Livonian order was a feudal order. The Swedish Empire expanded in the 17th century and ruled Estonia and Latvia for a century. Meanwhile, the German barons and burghers still retained all their powers, and they continued to retain their powers even when Russia took over this area. At the beginning of the 18th century, Peter the Great defeated Charles XII in the Great Northern War, and this became part of the Russian Empire, though the German barons and the German burghers still retained much of their influence all the way through to World War I. Partly because of the German influence and because the Germans were regarded as very efficient rulers, these were also very advanced societies, economically, educationally, and so on, much more advanced than any other part of the Russian Empire at that time. Though one should say at this time also the Russian Empire was advancing very much economically, socially, and so on, and never before or since has Russia been so much a part of Europe as this period before World War I, when Russian sparkling wine was very much appreciated in cities like Paris and considered as good as the stuff from Champagne. Russia was simply a part of Europe. This was a part of the Russian Empire, and particularly Latvia, Estonia, to a lesser extent Lithuania, were some of the leading industrial, social places of that time. I'll show you a glimpse of that in a minute. What are we talking about? Classical Tallinn, medieval city, perfectly intact city walls still, completely unspoilt inside. On the horizon, that has had only one change, the skyline has had only one change in the last 600 years, and that is that Orthodox onion-domed church which the Russian Empire built there in the 1890s, as they did in all non-Orthodox countries that they conquered as part of the Russian Empire. But apart from that, the skyline of Tallinn has not changed. It's retained its medieval character, though now outside of that we have a stunningly modern city. More of that later from Delaney. Riga, on the other hand, has other attractions that are quite different. I realise I'm in Barcelona and I'm not going to teach you about modernism, but the prevailing architecture of Riga that is most magnificent is the Jugendstil, Art Nouveau Jugendstil of the 1890s, 1900s. These are some buildings built by Mikhail Eisenstein, the father of Sergei Eisenstein, the Soviet film director. Mikhail Eisenstein was an engineer who built these gorgeous buildings and which reflected the city of the time. This was a very modern city, very advanced, very cosmopolitan. The architects were Russians, Germans, Latvians. The clients were Russians, Germans, Latvians, Jews, Poles. This was the kind of city that it was. And these buildings still standing today, and there are whole streets of them. Because the Baltic states were forgotten about during the Soviet period, nobody ever remembered that Riga is one of the great Jugendstil cities, along with Helsinki, that people forget about too. This, the history of language policy, Estonian and Latvian were essentially peasants' languages. They were studied by the German pastors and academics. Herder, the originator of, if you like, ethnicity and ethnic studies, actually studied in the Baltic states. The Bible was translated in the 16th, 17th century following the Reformation. The Swedish Times brought education as was common in Sweden at that time, and that stuck. And education, their own language, already developed from the Swedish Times and increasingly in the 19th century. And we had the growth of national literature in a classic national awakening period, as elsewhere in Europe and Eastern Europe in the middle of the 19th century. In the 19th century also, the Estonians found that how close their language was to that of Finnish. This is an Estonian peculiarity. Delaney will talk maybe more about that. But until then, all orthography was basically German orthography. And it was only in the 19th century that these countries developed their own orthography. There were Russification moves from the 1880s. The Russians restricted the Estonian and Latvian language, but they also restricted the German language. The German burghers had to write their protocols in Russian now. So they would have a meeting beforehand, decide everything, and then have a 5-minute meeting where the protocol was written in Russian. That was the way you did things in the Russian Empire if you were German. It was a three-cornered battle, and as opposed to other national awakenings that had, if you like, one enemy, one empire over them, if you think of, the Austro-Hungarian Empire or something like that, in Estonia and Latvia, you always had two enemies. You had the Russian Empire, you had the Germans playing one off against the other, supporting one against the other. This was a three-sided contest. And Estonian Latvian education was largely restored after the 1905 revolution, which was quite a serious matter in the Baltic states as it was in St. Petersburg. A lot of the anger of the revolutionaries was against the Germans, so a lot of German manors were burnt at this time. So you see that three-cornered sort of contest coming out there. And